The moment I descended into the Mariana Trench, I felt something watching me, not from the water around me, but from the darkness beneath, where no light should ever reach. I remember the first time I broke one of the 11 strange rules we're forced to follow, just to survive this descent. How a single misstep made the shadows stir closer. Every flicker of my flashlight, every bubble rising past me, reminded me that the trench had its own rules, and breaking them wasn't just dangerous, it was lethal. I don't know how long I'll last before the next one finds me. I remember the first time I almost ignored Rule 1, never turn off your flashlight while descending into the trench, thinking the faint glow of my equipment might be enough to guide me. The Mariana Trench had a way of swallowing the tiniest sparks of confidence, and as I descended, the water around me thickened into a black so deep it felt alive. My bubbles rose slowly past me, leaving trembling trails in the heavy water, and I could feel a current pressing against my suit, as if the darkness itself were aware of my presence. "It's just the shadows," I whispered under my breath, but even saying it aloud did little to calm the cold dread curling through my chest. Every flicker of the beam reminded me that light here wasn't just illumination, it was survival. The flashlight cut a narrow, trembling path through the void, revealing jagged rocks that jutted out like broken teeth. I could see particles suspended in the water, drifting like tiny ghosts, and the movement of each one felt deliberate, unnervingly slow. Shadows twisted at the edge of the light, stretching into shapes that my brain refused to name. I clenched my jaw and focused on my console, counting the meters I descended, though time seemed to bend and stretch with the oppressive darkness. Every second felt heavier than the last, and the further I went, the more I realized the trench didn't care about rules. It imposed them. By the time I reached a small plateau along the trench wall, I noticed the subtle shift in pressure around me. It wasn't violent or sudden, but it pressed like unseen fingers on my suit, making each movement deliberate and tense. I could feel something moving beneath me, below the edge of the light, a slow, purposeful motion that seemed to synchronize with my heartbeat. I whispered to myself again, trying to ground my thoughts. Focus. Keep the light steady. The beam was my lifeline, my only tether to the surface world, and even the slightest lapse could give the dark a chance to reach in. I thought about the training, the briefings before the dive, when the instructors told us that descending here was more than physics. It was discipline, focus, and respect for the unknown. I had never understood the weight of their words until this moment, when I realized a single flicker could mean the difference between returning or being swallowed whole. The trench had patience. It measured mistakes in heartbeats and hesitation. My flashlight trembled slightly in my grip as I pushed myself deeper, scanning every crevice and ridge. Hours, or what felt like hours, passed, and my eyes strained to maintain focus on the fragile cone of light. Movement continued just beyond its reach, teasing the edges of vision I wasn't supposed to acknowledge. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind, stretched thin and desperate, but instinct overruled reason. My flashlight was no longer just a tool. It had become an extension of my awareness, an armor against the silent, patient darkness that pressed around me. My every thought returned to the single directive that had brought me here and kept me alive so far. As I descended, the walls of the trench seemed to lean closer, jagged edges stretching outward, almost like the trench itself was alive and inspecting me. Currents shifted in ways that felt deliberate, carrying with them faint disturbances, subtle shapes moving beyond the light. I forced myself to focus on the path ahead, on the light, and the readings on my console, but every fiber of my being screamed that I wasn't alone. The water seemed to pulse around me, and I realized that this place had no mercy for error. The weight of the deep pressed in, reminding me with every bubble that a lapse in focus could be fatal. Then I saw it, a fleeting distortion in the corner of the flashlight beam. My stomach lurched as I realized it wasn't a fish or debris. It moved too deliberately, too purposefully. I forced my eyes back to the illuminated path and tightened my grip. The trench didn't forgive curiosity, and I could feel that first lapse of attention as if it had left a mark. I whispered again, "Stay focused, keep the light steady," and pressed forward, my body tense and my mind alert. Even at this depth, I began to notice the subtle things: rocks that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking, sediment that parted in patterns, currents that brushed against my suit, as if aware of my exact position. My flashlight was my only defense, the fragile boundary between me and something far older, far stranger than I could comprehend. The pressure of the water became almost tangible, pressing on my chest and making each breath heavier, each movement calculated. I realized that Rule 1, never turn off your flashlight while descending into the trench, was no guideline. It was the first of many steps I had to obey if I wanted to survive. Near the trench floor, shapes seemed to pulse and writhe just out of reach, teasing me with impossible angles and movements that made no sense. I could hear faint currents brushing past, whispering against my suit, and the beam of my light became the only proof of my presence in this void. A small flicker made me tense, a heartbeat of darkness that felt endless. I pressed on, forcing each step to be deliberate, each sweep of the flashlight steady. One lapse, one brief darkness, and I knew the trench would claim what I had failed to protect. The deeper I descended, the more aware I became of the trench as a living entity. Shapes moved beyond my light, subtly, deliberately, testing me, and I realized that every movement, every glance could provoke something I wasn't ready to confront. My grip on the flashlight was tight enough to ache, my focus absolute. I reminded myself again, silently, that light was life here, that it tethered me to sanity and survival alike. Every shift of shadow beyond the beam felt like a pulse, a heartbeat, a warning that this place demanded respect and unwavering attention. The descent continued, slower than I thought possible, each meter deeper feeling heavier, more oppressive. The water around me, pressed with a cold intelligence, currents brushing against my suit with deliberate rhythm. I could feel unseen shapes moving beyond my light, always present, always waiting. My flashlight was steady, unwavering, slicing a path through the darkness, and I whispered to myself again, a mantra of survival: keep it steady, never falter, never let the darkness claim even a second of my focus. The trench was patient, but I could sense it had begun marking me, testing my resolve, and I feared that my first real mistake was only a heartbeat away. Even as my flashlight steadied, I remembered Rule 2, never look directly at the shapes that move beyond your light, and forced myself to keep my eyes fixed on the illuminated path. My heart pounded as the trench seemed to respond to every movement, shadows stretching just beyond the beam. I could feel a presence, patient and deliberate, slipping in and out of perception, and the thought of glancing at it made my stomach churn. Every instinct screamed to look, to see what was there, but experience had taught me that curiosity here was a dangerous, almost fatal indulgence. I gritted my teeth and pressed on, following the narrow path of light, like it was the only thing tethering me to the world I had left behind. The water around me was dense, almost viscous, carrying faint distortions that made my flashlight flicker across impossible angles. Shapes drifted beyond the light, vague and undulating, and I forced my mind to ignore them, focusing on the trench floor and the jagged ridges that jutted out like broken teeth. My bubbles rose slowly, the only sound in a vast, oppressive silence, and every so often I sensed a current brushing against my suit in ways that felt intelligent. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, the product of isolation and pressure, but the rhythm of the movement seemed deliberate, synchronized, almost aware of my presence. I caught a glimpse of something larger, its bulk barely visible in the corner of my eye, and my stomach clenched. My grip on the flashlight tightened until my knuckles ached, but I refused to glance, knowing that even the briefest eye contact could invite disaster. The shapes beyond the light were patient, teasing, and the water seemed to pulse in response to my anxiety. I whispered to myself, repeating fragments of training I'd barely remembered. Focus on what you can see. Never look directly at what you can't. Each syllable became a lifeline, a mental tether to reality as the darkness pressed closer, testing my discipline and resolve. Minutes dragged into eternity as I navigated around jagged rock formations that seemed to loom closer than they should. Every shadow beyond my flashlight's beam twisted unnaturally, bending and stretching in ways that defied logic. The deeper I descended, the more aware I became that the trench was not passive. It was a presence, and the forms beyond my light were part of it, observing and cataloging my every move. My breath came shallow and rapid, and I repeated the warning in my mind. Never look directly at the shapes that move beyond your light. It wasn't just advice, it was a rule that separated the living from the lost. Then the water shifted suddenly, a current from below lifting me slightly, almost teasing. I fought against it, muscles straining, flashlight sweeping in steady arcs over the trench floor. A fleeting distortion at the edge of the light made my heart lurch, a shape too fast, too fluid, too deliberate to be anything natural. I swallowed hard and resisted the urge to glance, reminding myself silently that obeying the rule was the only way to survive. Even as curiosity clawed at me, I forced my eyes to the rocks and sediment beneath, tracing each detail, cataloging every bump and fissure to anchor my mind in what I could see. Time became meaningless as I pushed further into the abyss. The pressure of the water seemed to press not only on my suit, but on my thoughts, squeezing them until only survival instincts remained. Shapes swirled beyond the cone of my flashlight, teasing the edges of perception, almost daring me to look. My hand ached from gripping the light so tightly, but I couldn't risk even the briefest lapse. I whispered reassurances, spoke to the trench as if it could hear, promising my compliance, praying that my discipline would be enough. The shapes didn't strike, didn't approach, but their awareness was palpable, and I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me like a living thing. A sudden shadow stretched across the trench floor, larger than any rock or drift, and my pulse shot up. The movement was smooth and deliberate, sliding into angles that made no sense. I froze in place, flashlight sweeping just ahead, ignoring the temptation to glance at the impossible. The thought of what could happen if I broke Rule 2, never look directly at the shapes that move beyond your light, gripped me like ice, a warning echoing in my mind. I took a deep breath and forced myself to move again, step by careful step, each movement measured, each flick of the beam controlled, as if my very life depended on discipline, and it did. Hours, or what felt like hours, passed in this tense, silent crawl through the abyss. Currents whispered across my suit, brushing at my helmet, teasing the edges of the flashlight's cone. Shapes slid past, barely perceptible, and the trench seemed to pulse with a rhythm of observation, a calculated patience I couldn't comprehend. I reminded myself to focus on what I could see, to anchor my mind in the familiar, and to ignore the lurking, impossible forms beyond the light. Any deviation, any glance, could turn curiosity into death. Then came the moment that froze me completely. Something moved below and behind me, shifting deliberately in ways that suggested it knew my exact position. I could feel it, larger than any creature I had encountered, tracing my path like a predator studying its prey. I forced my eyes down, refusing to look, every instinct screaming at me to turn. I gritted my teeth and whispered through my calm, "I'm okay," just keeping steady, hoping my voice would mask my terror. The shapes didn't advance, but their presence pressed in, and I realized that a single mistake could be fatal. I moved cautiously, letting my flashlight sweep wide arcs over the trench floor, noting every jagged rock, every drift of sediment, ignoring the impossible movements just beyond the cone of light. The deeper I went, the more I sensed that the shapes were testing me, probing for hesitation. My grip on the light ached, my chest burned, and my mind teetered on the edge of panic. But I forced focus, repeating the mantra silently, "Never look directly at the shapes that move beyond your light." Discipline was my only weapon, and obedience my only hope. By the time I reached the next plateau, a flat section of rock and sediment, I realized the trench had begun to teach me its rhythm. Currents, shadows, shapes, all moved in patterns, almost like they were observing my adherence to the rules. I adjusted my breathing, slowed my heartbeat, and let the flashlight trace every detail of the visible, careful not to acknowledge the impossible forms beyond its edge. The shapes lingered, patient and silent, testing me, measuring me, and I understood that any lapse could be the last moment of awareness I would ever have. A slight flicker in the water made my pulse spike. The dark forms had shifted, moving with intelligence, aware of every second, every hesitation. I tightened my grip, sweated under my suit, and forced the flashlight along a steady, unwavering path. My breath echoed faintly inside my helmet, a rhythm that the trench seemed to notice, almost to enjoy. I whispered again, not to myself but as a pledge, promising compliance to the abyss that surrounded me. One glance, one moment of curiosity, and I might never reach the next plateau or the next rule. And then a deep, deliberate shadow moved directly below me, vast and unbroken, and I knew it had been waiting, patient and calculating. My flashlight beam sliced the darkness in thin arcs, but I could feel the presence, like a pressure of air in a vacuum, impossibly heavy and deliberate. Every instinct screamed to move, to flee, but my training, and the terrifying logic of Rule 2, never look directly at the shapes that move beyond your light, kept me rooted, forcing measured breaths and controlled motion. And as I continued, I realized the abyss was far from done testing me. Even with my flashlight steady and my gaze fixed, I remembered Rule 3, never remove your helmet until you are back at the surface, and forced my jaw tight, reminding myself why it existed. The pressure down here was more than physical. It felt like the trench itself could crush a person's mind as easily as their body. I could feel the cold seeps of water pressing against the suit, tiny currents slipping through the seals and making my skin crawl. Thoughts of relief and fresh air teased me, a temptation I had learned to resist after countless warnings from instructors. Any impulse to lift the helmet, even for a second, felt absurdly dangerous here, as if the water could reach in and claim me instantly. As I descended deeper, the trench floor spread into an alien landscape of jagged rock formations and faint glows from bioluminescent organisms. I could feel every current brush against my suit, as if the water itself had intention, testing my awareness and patience. A shadow flickered at the edge of my light, too fluid to define, and I forced my mind back to the illuminated path, refusing to look closer. The helmet was more than protection. It was a lifeline. Removing it here would be unthinkable, reckless, a surrender to forces I could barely comprehend. Every instinct screamed at me to respect the rule, to stay completely enclosed and shielded in the suit. The deeper I went, the heavier the water felt, compressing around me in invisible layers that pressed against every joint and seam of my suit. My breathing was shallow, careful, controlled, and the helmet muffled the steady rush of blood in my ears. I could feel subtle vibrations underfoot, movements of unknown creatures shifting in the distance, beyond my cone of light. The temptation to lift the helmet, to take a breath of imagined fresh air, became almost unbearable. But I remembered the stories of divers who had ignored this simple rule. Those stories ended before the surface was ever reached. The trench did not forgive recklessness, and I could sense its patience, waiting for a lapse. I pushed forward, muscles aching from maintaining perfect posture against the currents, eyes scanning every crack and rise in the jagged trench walls. Small lights drifted past, the faint shimmer of plankton or unknown organisms, but I refused to acknowledge the shapes beyond my light. Each step required focus, each movement a delicate negotiation with the abyss. The helmet weighed heavily on me, both a physical burden and a comfort, a reminder that isolation in this trench was total and the consequences of exposure were absolute. Removing it would be madness. I reminded myself of Rule 3, never remove your helmet until you are back at the surface. Anchoring my will to its simple logic, a subtle tremor ran through the trench floor, sending a ripple along the rocks and silt. It wasn't violent, but it was deliberate, as though the earth itself was breathing beneath me. My flashlight flickered, and I felt the edge of panic rise, the urge to tear at the helmet to see what was real and what wasn't. I fought the impulse with every fiber of my being, focusing instead on the faint reading of my depth meter and the path ahead. The trench seemed alive, and I could feel a presence that reacted to hesitation, something that studied every movement, every thought. The helmet was not just protection, it was the thin line between survival and becoming part of the trench itself. Currents shifted, brushing my suit in strange, intelligent patterns, and I realized I was not alone. Shapes beyond the light remained just at the periphery, always present, never striking, testing my resolve. The deeper I descended, the more I understood that the helmet wasn't only a physical shield, it was a psychological one. It created a boundary between the known and unknown, a separation that my mind needed to survive. Even for a moment, the thought of removing it sent chills through me, a reminder of why the rule existed in the first place. Hours passed in this careful, tense crawl through the abyss. Each time my flashlight illuminated the trench floor, I noted tiny disturbances. Sediment shifted, small shapes flickered, but I resisted the urge to glance at them. My helmet pressed tight against my face, muffling every sound except my own breathing, which became a mantra: calm, steady, disciplined. The temptation to remove it even for a breath never truly disappeared, but I forced myself to repeat the rule silently, feeling its logic anchor me amidst the chaos of pressure, darkness, and impossible shadows. Then a current stronger than the others pushed against me from below, making my suit lurch slightly. I pressed my flashlight against the trench floor and gritted my teeth, refusing to let panic take over. My mind fought the claustrophobia, the pressure, the suffocating weight of water and darkness. I could feel shapes sliding just outside my light, testing, observing, measuring. I reminded myself silently, never remove the helmet until you are back at the surface. Obedience was survival, and every instinct that screamed otherwise had to be ignored. My flashlight beam trembled slightly as I navigated a narrow canyon in the trench floor. Faint pulses of movement suggested something vast was moving in the depths below me, too large to be any known creature. I forced my eyes along the illuminated path, muscles tensing with each shift of water and sediment. Thoughts of relief, of a momentary breath without the helmet, surfaced, but I crushed them instantly, knowing that the helmet was the only barrier between me and the abyss. Each second of hesitation felt like eternity, each shadow beyond the light a silent threat waiting for me to falter. Near the bottom of a deep ravine, the trench opened into a vast, empty plain of jagged rock and sediment. Shadows moved beyond the cone of light, teasing shapes I could not identify. The pressure pressed harder, currents shifted unpredictably, and my arms ached from gripping the flashlight so tightly. I whispered to myself as if the trench could hear, keep the helmet on, stay enclosed, survive. The rule that had seemed abstract at the surface was now a lifeline, a border between existence and disappearance, and I could feel every second that it demanded respect. A shadow shifted closer, deliberate, intelligent, testing me. I froze, heartbeat racing, grip tightening on the flashlight. I thought again of Rule 3, never remove your helmet until you are back at the surface, letting it anchor me against panic. Even in the suffocating pressure of the trench, with shapes moving just beyond the light, the helmet was my lifeline, my shield against something that was patient, deliberate, and beyond comprehension. Every fiber of my being reminded me that survival was obedience, and the next second could change everything. Even as I forced my breathing to remain steady, I remembered Rule 4, never follow sounds that come from outside your equipment's sensors. A warning I had thought was paranoia, until the abyss itself began to demonstrate its consequences. A faint vibration rippled through the water, almost like whispers carried by the currents, and part of me wanted to investigate, but every instinct screamed to stay within the safety of the instruments, to trust the sensors that had never lied. I gritted my teeth and focused on the light and the readouts, feeling a pulse of awareness beneath me, as though the trench was testing patience as a form of obedience. The deeper I went, the more subtle the sounds became. Faint groans, the shift of sediment, almost imperceptible swirls against my suit, but always beyond the sensors, always just outside the realm of verified reality. My flashlight swept methodically over the jagged terrain, but the water seemed alive with unseen currents and shapes, twisting just beyond reach. I could feel them, their presence deliberate and patient, a reminder that the abyss operated by its own rules. The temptation to follow a whisper, to chase what I could hear but not measure, clawed at my mind like a predator. I tried to reason with myself, imagining the faint sounds were natural, shifting rock, distant sea creatures, pressure releasing from the trench walls, but the subtle rhythm, the deliberate nature of the vibrations, suggested something aware, waiting, observing. My breath became shallow as the sounds pulsed through the water, brushing past my helmet like invisible hands. Each moment of hesitation heightened the tension, each faint noise outside the sensors a test. I clenched my fists, forcing my mind back to the readouts, repeating the rules silently as a mantra. As I navigated a narrow chasm, currents twisted unexpectedly, and the whispers grew closer, almost forming patterns that suggested intent. My fingers trembled on the controls, flashlight sweeping slow arcs over the trench floor, following each contour with obsessive care. I reminded myself that Rule 4, never follow sounds that come from outside your equipment's sensors, wasn't just a guideline, it was a boundary between survival and disaster. Every impulse to chase what I could hear would have been fatal. Even in the oppressive alien stillness, I realized that restraint was as vital as the flashlight in maintaining life. The trench seemed to breathe around me, the shadows and shapes shifting with a rhythm that made my pulse jump. I could feel the floor subtly vibrating under my suit, a sensation that made my arms ache and my mind hyper-aware. Shapes flickered just beyond my light, teasing, testing, measuring my patience. I focused on the readings, the distance markers, the faint hum of my own equipment, the only reality I could trust. Following instinct, curiosity, or the whispers of the trench would have been reckless, and I shuddered to imagine what lurked for those who ignored this rule. A sudden flicker of movement made my heart lurch, but I forced myself to keep my eyes on the illuminated path. The whispers seemed to follow my progress, brushing past like phantom currents, subtle and deliberate. I forced my mind to catalog everything within the flashlight's beam. The rocks, the sediment, the faint glows from bioluminescent organisms, and ignore everything else. The deeper I descended, the more the trench seemed to assert its presence, deliberate and intelligent, reminding me that compliance was my only safeguard. Hours, or what I sensed as hours, passed in this tense, measured crawl. I could feel the trench pressing against every surface of my suit, currents brushing in impossible patterns, and the faint whispers persisted, testing my resolve. Shapes moved beyond the light, their forms incomprehensible, always patient, observing every adjustment of my flashlight, every shift of my body. My heartbeat became a rhythm I could hear inside the helmet, echoing in my chest as a warning. Following the sounds would have been fatal, and I clung to the rule as a lifeline, my only connection to survival in a world that defied logic. I entered a narrow canyon, where the trench walls closed in, currents twisting unpredictably. Whispers now carried subtle tones, almost like voices trying to beckon me, to draw me away from the path and the light. My fingers trembled on the controls, and the weight of the helmet pressed down on my neck, grounding me against the allure of curiosity. I repeated the rule silently, a lifeline against the seductive danger of the unknown. Never follow sounds that come from outside your equipment's sensors. Each beat of my heart reminded me that the abyss was alive, patient, and watching. Then I sensed something beneath me, a slow shifting that didn't belong to any natural current. The whispers coalesced into something almost tangible, a rhythm in the water that seemed to synchronize with my heartbeat. I froze, flashlight sweeping over the trench floor, noting every detail, every jagged rock, every ripple of sediment. The trench seemed to study my restraint, testing my obedience. The impulse to investigate was immense, almost unbearable, but I forced myself to focus on the path and the readings, knowing that one false step could trigger consequences I could not survive. A shadow stretched across the floor, moving without current, deliberate and intelligent, almost taunting me. My pulse surged as the whispers grew louder, yet I forced my focus on the beam of light, resisting every urge to chase the phantom sounds. The trench pressed in from every side, patient, aware, measuring my compliance. I reminded myself, silently and desperately, that survival here required discipline and unwavering adherence to the rules. And as I edged forward, I realized the next moment might bring the first real test of whether I could obey fully or pay a price too great to recover from. The whispers behind me sharpened into something colder, and just as I felt the trench walls tightening around my nerves, I remembered Rule 5. If your lights turn red, keep moving forward no matter what you see. A rule I prayed I would never need. My hand hovered near the control panel as a thin tremor ran through the current, almost like the water itself was watching the next decision I made. My flashlight beam wavered, and for a second, I thought it was the same flicker I had seen before, until the edges of the light began to warm with a faint, unnatural red. I swallowed hard, pulse hammering, because red didn't come from equipment malfunction. Red meant something had noticed me. The light deepened in color, bleeding into the water like a warning flare, and I felt the pressure shift in a way that made my bones ache. Every instinct told me to turn back, to retreat toward the last familiar piece of the trench, but the rule demanded the opposite. The moment the lights changed, stopping meant surrender. I forced my legs to move, one slow step at a time, even though the darkness ahead felt heavier than before. Shadows thickened around me, expanding and contracting in unnatural rhythms, and the faint whispering that had followed me now blended into a low hum, resonating through the water. The trench floor under me vibrated faintly, like the heartbeat of something massive hidden below, and the red glow painted the jagged stones with an eerie warmth that made everything look alive. I adjusted my flashlight angle, trying to keep my breathing steady, but the glow around me made the light feel useless. Dim, swallowed, overpowered. I kept walking, fighting the impulse to look behind me, where I sensed the shadows gathering, drawn by the crimson shifting around my suit. My fingers ached from how tightly I held the flashlight, but stopping wasn't an option. I moved forward, because the rule left no room for hesitation. The hiss of water pressure around my helmet shifted, becoming a long, steady pulse, like something enormous breathing somewhere above or below me. I kept my eyes pinned forward as the red flooded deeper into my peripheral vision, slowly overtaking the white beam until it looked like I was walking through a dark, blood-lit fog. The rocks ahead twisted into strange shapes, silhouettes stretching and shrinking in ways that defied logic, but I didn't dare shift my gaze. Forward was the only direction left. Every pulse of the red glow felt like a countdown. Something large drifted in the corner of my eye, a shape that didn't move like any creature I had studied, long and jointless and impossibly smooth. I forced myself not to turn, not to react, even though my instincts clawed at me like panic sharpening into physical pain. The trench around me seemed to tilt slightly, as if whatever had entered the edges of my vision was bending the landscape. My breath stuttered, but I kept walking, slow, precise steps forward. The red deepened further, turning the water around me into something thick and suffocating. As I pressed deeper into the crimson glare, the hum behind me shifted into something sharper, almost like a call, not a voice, not something human, but a beckoning pulse that vibrated through my bones. My steps faltered, momentarily betraying the rule, but I corrected myself immediately, forcing my feet to move faster. The trench walls on either side seemed to narrow and widen with each pulse of light, disorienting, almost hypnotic. The red glow reflected off particles drifting in the water, swirling into patterns that looked too intentional to be natural. I felt a current brush the back of my suit, slow and deliberate, as though a hand, or something shaped like one, was gliding just behind me. My body tensed so violently that my knees almost buckled, and the urge to whirl around nearly broke through my discipline. But I didn't stop. I kept walking into the red flashlight, useless now, the beam swallowed by the thick, dense glow surrounding me. The pressure around me increased, compressing my chest inside the suit, each breath an act of stubborn defiance. The red light flickered suddenly, pulsing in rapid bursts like a heartbeat accelerating out of control. Shadows around the edges of my vision stretched longer, reaching toward me with every pulse, almost as if they were synchronizing with the light. My steps quickened without conscious thought, the trench floor uneven beneath my boots. The vibrations coming from behind grew stronger, no longer subtle whispers, but an approaching force I could feel down my spine. Every instinct screamed that something was closing in, but the only safety, the only hope was forward. The water ahead thinned into a narrow passage, jagged rock walls rising like the ribs of some colossal creature. The red light painted the stone surfaces in uneven streaks, revealing cracks deep enough to swallow a person whole. I squeezed through carefully, body pressed tight as currents pushed at my back with increasing aggression. Something scraped lightly along the rocks behind me, not a sound, but a pressure wave, as if the water was being displaced by something massive forcing its way toward me. I moved faster, breath catching inside the helmet. The passage opened into a wider chamber, and for a moment, the red light dimmed, giving me a sliver of relief. But as soon as I stepped inside, the red flared brighter than before, almost blinding, and everything around me warped in the glow. Shadows twisted into shapes that resembled limbs, faces, impossible forms that dissolved the second I tried to focus on them. My pulse hammered hard enough to make my vision blur, but I didn't stop moving. The floor beneath me trembled, the hum behind me turning into a slow thudding rhythm that matched my own heartbeat too perfectly. Something shifted above me, a massive silhouette passing just beyond the reach of the red light, large enough to blot out parts of the trench ceiling. The water pressed down in a sudden wave, as if responding to its presence, and I stumbled forward, catching myself with shaking arms. The red glow thickened again, wrapping around me like a warning or a cage. I didn't dare slow down. I didn't dare breathe too deeply. Something behind me moved with newfound speed, pushing water forward in a steady, deliberate pressure that told me whatever it was had finally begun to follow. The trench floor dropped suddenly into a slope I hadn't expected, and my foot slid, sending me staggering down several meters before I caught myself. The red lighting distorted the descent, making the rocks look slick, almost moving, and panic clawed up my spine. The hum behind me grew sharper, resonating through my ribs, vibrating against the inside of my helmet. I pushed forward, half running now, flashlight bouncing uselessly in my hand as the red swallowed everything ahead of me. Something enormous shifted in the darkness behind, and the water current surged with it, rushing forward, as though trying to drag me back toward the thing that waited just outside my vision. I felt it, something brushing the back of my leg through the suit, not a current, not sediment. Something with weight, something deliberate. My breath hitched, and for the first time since the descent began, my legs nearly stopped on instinct. But the rule was absolute, and stopping now meant surrendering to what followed. I forced a final desperate sprint forward, heart in my throat, red light pulsing violently around me. The slope leveled out, the pressure lessened for a split second, and I dared to hope, only for the light to flicker sharply, revealing a shape in front of me that should not have been there at all. The red light still burned in my vision, as I crouched over a strange metallic fragment partially embedded in the trench floor. And I immediately remembered Rule 6. Never remove your gloves while handling any object in the trench. My fingers ached from gripping the flashlight, but the thought of touching the metal with bare skin made my stomach twist. It was cold, impossibly smooth, and seemed to vibrate faintly under the pressure of the water, like it was alive. Every instinct screamed to pull away, to leave it untouched, but curiosity and necessity battled within me. I forced my hands to remain gloved, steadying the flashlight with one hand while the other hovered just above the object, refusing to make contact beyond the protective layer of suit. The fragment shimmered faintly, reflecting the red light in irregular angles, that made it seem like it shifted as I looked. My helmet fogged slightly from my rapid breathing, but I forced calm, knowing that removing the gloves here could expose me to something I wasn't prepared to survive. I traced the edges with gloved fingers, noting the jagged, alien texture, the way the metal absorbed the light instead of reflecting it normally. Currents stirred around me, subtle but deliberate, as though the trench itself was watching my every movement. The vibrations beneath my boots increased slightly, a pulse resonating up from the trench floor, and I realized the artifact wasn't just a relic, it was a beacon of attention I had no choice but to respect. I could hear the faint, persistent hum of movement behind me, shadows just outside the red light shifting with a rhythm that mirrored the pulses coming from the object. My gloved hands remained firmly in place as I examined it, heart hammering against the chest plate of the suit. The shape was elongated, narrow, tapering into something that could have been a handle or a warning. I pressed forward carefully, sliding the object slightly to inspect it further, and the vibrations seemed to respond, flowing through the water like recognition. Panic wanted to grip me, but the rule anchored my decisions. Every story I had ever heard about divers ignoring this particular rule ended in disappearance. I had to obey to survive. The trench around me seemed to react to the motion, currents brushing against my suit in patterns that felt deliberate, almost alive. Shapes beyond the light moved in tandem, with the pulses coming from the object, teasing me without fully revealing themselves. I forced myself to take shallow, controlled breaths, whispering to myself to stay focused. The glove barrier felt like the only shield between me and whatever unknown forces resided in the artifact. The red light intensified, bouncing off the edges of the trench and highlighting every curve of the mysterious fragment, drawing my attention in, but I did not lift my hands. Obedience was survival, and curiosity without it had no place in the trench. A sudden tremor ran along the trench floor, and I stumbled slightly, pressing the object closer against the rocks to stabilize myself. It hummed in response, a low vibration that resonated through my gloved fingers, and I froze, realizing it had sensed my movement. I could feel the surrounding water shift subtly, like something massive was observing from just beyond the cone of light. My heart raced as the red glow flickered again, casting eerie shadows along the jagged walls. Every instinct screamed to remove the gloves, to retreat, but I didn't dare. Rule 6 was absolute. Any breach here could mean immediate loss, and the trench was patient but deadly. Hours, or what felt like hours, passed as I studied the artifact, carefully sliding and adjusting it with the gloves intact. The shapes beyond my light lingered, vast and incomprehensible, moving with deliberate intelligence. I forced myself to catalog every detail I could see in the beam, ignoring the shadows, ignoring the whispers, ignoring the currents that seemed to push me subtly toward the object. My gloves were my lifeline, keeping my hands protected from contact with the unknown, and I reminded myself silently that discipline was my only chance at survival. The trench had begun to assert its presence more tangibly, every pulse of vibration and movement reinforcing the stakes of this simple rule. A faint hum shifted higher in frequency, resonating directly through the helmet and body. My flashlight swung over the trench floor, sweeping past shapes that seemed almost alive, curving and twisting just beyond reach. The artifact vibrated in response, pulsing gently against my gloves as if communicating. I resisted the urge to pick it up entirely, or touch it with bare skin. Each moment felt like a test of will and discipline, and the water seemed heavier, more oppressive with every careful second. The trench was alive here, and the red light turned the environment into a surreal, almost hostile landscape, pressing me to obey without hesitation. Then a current surged unexpectedly from beneath the fragment, lifting it slightly, as if the water itself wanted it to move. My gloved fingers tightened, holding it firmly, and I felt the pulse resonate through my arms, a vibration unlike anything natural. Shadows moved at impossible speeds, just outside the red glow, testing my attention and resolve. My breath caught in my chest, and I forced myself to stay calm, to move methodically, and never remove my gloves. The rules were not suggestions, they were survival mandates, and the trench made sure every infraction had consequences, even if only through pressure and fear. The deeper I explored the artifact, the more the currents seemed to respond, swirling around the edges of my suit like invisible fingers. I pressed forward slowly, gloved hand brushing the object to reposition it, and sensed the shapes behind me tighten their watch. Red light flared and faded, as if signaling approval or warning, and I couldn't tell which. Every instinct screamed to retreat, to remove the gloves in desperation, but obedience anchored me. Survival demanded restraint, and the trench measured every failure, patient and deliberate. A massive shadow passed over the red glow, stretching across the trench floor like a predator testing its prey. I froze, keeping hands firmly gloved, feeling the vibrations of the trench resonate with the artifact. The water around me pulsed, a rhythm that matched my heartbeat, making every movement a calculated act of life or death. I whispered to myself, promising to keep control, to keep the gloves in place, to obey the rules that had carried me this far. The artifact hummed once more, brighter, heavier, almost breathing under my fingers, and I realized the next step I took would determine whether I survived the encounter or became part of the trench's patient collection. Even as I pressed forward through the crimson glow of the trench, I remembered Rule 7, never trust the readings on your instruments. If the water feels wrong, and felt a chill crawl across the inside of my suit. My depth meter and sensors all indicated steady conditions, currents within normal parameters, and yet the water around me pressed and shifted in ways that didn't match the numbers. The trench seemed alive, stretching, contracting, teasing with invisible fingers, and I realized that obedience to instinct could outweigh reliance on technology. My flashlight flickered faintly, and every shadow beyond the red glow seemed to respond to the slightest movement of my body. The vibration from the artifact I had handled earlier thrummed faintly through the trench floor, a constant reminder that the abyss was observing, cataloging, measuring my every decision. I moved slowly, flashlight scanning the jagged rocks and sediment, while my mind wrestled with a creeping doubt. Could I trust what the instruments told me? The hum of the currents carried subtle distortions that the sensors couldn't detect, and the shapes at the periphery of my vision twisted unnaturally, as if testing the boundary between technology and perception. I swallowed hard, forcing my breath to remain steady, and relied on the rule, trusting my instincts over the numbers. A shadow flitted across the floor, elongated and fluid, moving against the flow of the currents, and brushing past the edge of the flashlight beam. My gloved hands tightened around the equipment, knuckles whitening, as I reminded myself that the trench didn't just respond to physical actions. It responded to doubt, to hesitation, to miscalculated trust. The readings were lying. The pressure, the vibrations, and the subtle pulse of movement told me the truth. Forward was imperative, caution was survival, and every second spent debating the numbers could be my last. The trench seemed to whisper, reminding me that technology was a tool, but instinct was a shield. The farther I descended, the more the readings became inconsistent, fluctuating without cause, depth markers wavering, despite the unchanging slope of the trench floor. Currents shifted in irregular patterns, brushing against my suit like deliberate touches from invisible hands. Shadows just outside the red light swirled in slow hypnotic arcs, teasing and taunting with intent. My pulse raced as I realized how close I had come to relying on false data, and how quickly trust could turn survival into peril. I whispered to myself, repeating the rules silently, anchoring my decisions in intuition instead of instruments, every sense heightened to an almost unbearable degree. A sudden pulse ran through the water, brushing my body and making the trench floor tremble beneath my boots. The artifact's vibration synced with it, sending tiny shocks through the gloved hand holding it, and I froze, realizing that the trench wasn't just alive. It was communicating through subtle pressures and movements that sensors could not detect. I forced my eyes along the illuminated path, noting the patterns of sediment, the microcurrents, the faint glimmers of bioluminescent organisms, and ignored the readings that insisted everything was stable. One wrong move, One lapse in instinctual judgment could mean disappearance, and I was all too aware that the trench had no mercy for those who ignored its unspoken language. As I progressed, the shadows began to cluster, larger now, coalescing into shapes that suggested form but eluded definition. My instruments still reported calm conditions, but my entire body screamed otherwise. The red light intensified around me, painting the jagged walls and floor in angry hues, highlighting every movement and distortion. Currents tugged unpredictably at my suit, and I had to fight every urge to react mechanically, to rely on the numbers. Instead, I relied on feeling the water, the subtle shifts in pressure, the almost imperceptible movements that told me more than any gauge or readout could. The trench floor suddenly dipped into a shallow depression, and the shadows swirled with new urgency. My pulse leapt as I felt a subtle vibration pass through the suit, almost like footsteps in water, slow and deliberate. Every instinct screamed that the numbers were lies, that the instruments were tricking me, and I forced myself to ignore them. The shapes around me moved with impossible speed just beyond the cone of light, and I realized how dependent I had been on technology before this moment. Survival required abandoning it completely and trusting only the raw data of fear, touch, and observation. I edged forward into a narrow canyon that opened into a vast chamber, jagged walls rising like the ribs of some colossal creature. The red light painted every surface in stark relief, shadows stretching across impossible angles. Currents moved unpredictably, slapping against my suit, testing my balance, testing my patience. The reading still claimed stability, yet the trench pressed in around me with oppressive weight. I kept moving, guided by instinct and the rule alone, forcing myself to disregard the numbers and listen to the water itself. Then the water shifted suddenly, a massive pulse that ran along the floor and walls like the exhale of a hidden behemoth. My flashlight beam swung wildly, illuminating fleeting forms that were impossibly long, jointless and intelligent in motion. I swallowed hard, muscles tense, relying entirely on feeling, on intuition. The red glow flickered, casting everything into stark unnatural relief, and I realized that even a single glance at the sensors could break my focus and seal my fate. Forward was the only option. Hesitation was death. A shadow dropped suddenly in front of me, colossal and dark, blocking the red light for a brief, terrifying moment. Currents surged as though something had moved through the water just behind it, and I felt the pulse of energy radiating from the trench floor. My heart pounded against the chest plate of the suit, and every instinct screamed to retreat, to double-check the instruments, but I forced myself onward, trusting the water, trusting my gut, and trusting Rule 7, never trust the readings on your instruments if the water feels wrong, was all I had. The shadows surged closer, currents tugged harder, and I realized that obedience to instinct might be the only thing keeping me alive as the trench pressed in from all sides. The currents shifted violently around me, shadows stretching impossibly long, and I immediately remembered Rule 8. Never attempt to communicate with anything in the trench. Even thinking about it made a chill crawl up my spine. Every fiber of instinct screamed that attempting contact was a death sentence. I gripped my flashlight tighter, aware that something enormous was watching from beyond the red glow, something that seemed to understand hesitation and fear. Every pulse of the water vibrated through my suit, a reminder that this abyss was alive and deliberate, measuring my compliance. I forced my breathing steady, refusing to respond to any of the whispers or pulses that licked at the edge of perception. The trench walls narrowed around me, jagged and sharp, twisting in ways that defied the angles of my instruments. Shadows moved in tandem with the red glow, forming shapes that suggested faces, limbs, and eyes, but no definition could be trusted. Currents brushed deliberately against my arms and legs, teasing, testing, pressing, as if the trench itself were attempting to coerce me into a mistake. The temptation to call out, to signal, to reach beyond the safety of the helmet and gloves, clawed at my mind. I forced myself forward, repeating the rules silently, relying on obedience to survive. knowing that one moment of communication could cost my life. A vibration pulsed through the trench floor, subtle at first but quickly growing into a steady rhythm that echoed through my chest. The shadows at the periphery of my vision shifted, forming long, jointless shapes that seemed to move with a purpose. I kept moving, gloved hands tight on the flashlight, refusing to respond to the currents or the whispers that resonated like thoughts in my head. The water itself seemed to beckon, drawing my attention to impossible forms just beyond reach. But I clung to the rule: nothing must be acknowledged, nothing must be answered. Obedience was survival, and curiosity was the quickest way to disappear. As I navigated a narrow canyon, the trench floor shifted beneath me, causing sediment to rise in faint clouds. Shadows twisted in the red light, elongated and flickering, moving like dancers with impossible coordination. I resisted the urge to speak, to gesture, to establish contact, knowing that the trench was patient, intelligent, and unyielding. Each vibration, each current, each whispering pulse carried intent, but acknowledging it would be fatal. I moved carefully, methodically, scanning the floor and walls while ignoring the movements at the edge of perception. Every second was a test, and every instinct screamed that Rule 8 was as vital as the helmet, gloves, and light itself. The red glow pulsed in irregular bursts, illuminating jagged rock formations that seemed impossibly large, impossible to traverse, yet I continued forward. The water vibrated in subtle patterns, brushing against my suit in ways that suggested intelligence. Shadows formed again, teasing limbs, faces, impossible creatures that moved with purpose just beyond the light. My heartbeat echoed in the helmet, loud and relentless, and I forced each breath into calm, measured inhalations. The momentary thought to attempt communication rose, whispering in my mind, but I suppressed it instantly, remembering the rule, repeating it silently: never attempt to communicate. A sudden surge of current slammed against the trench floor, rolling my flashlight beam wildly across the jagged walls. Shapes emerged from the red, briefly illuminated, impossibly long and jointless, their forms dissolving before I could focus. The vibration under my boots intensified, and the shadows shifted with a speed that defied logic. I pressed forward, moving steadily into the chamber ahead, gloved hands clenching the flashlight, as if it were the only tether keeping me alive. The red light flickered again, and the whispers, or thoughts, brushed against my helmet like fingers. I did not respond. Obedience was the only way through. Hours, or what I perceived as hours, passed in this tense crawl through the abyss, every vibration, every movement, every shadow testing my resolve. I scanned meticulously, keeping the flashlight beam steady, gloved fingers rigid on the controls, refusing to acknowledge anything beyond the cone of light. Currents tugged with deliberate intent, teasing, trying to make me break the rule. I reminded myself silently of Rule 8, never attempt to communicate with anything in the trench, letting it anchor my decisions, letting instinct override curiosity. Each step forward was a victory against the abyss's patient attempts to manipulate my mind. The trench opened into a wider expanse, red light spilling across jagged formations that seemed to grow larger, more alien and alive. Shadows swirled with impossible speed, almost as if aware that I was watching. Currents tugged in opposing directions, a subtle test of balance and will, and I forced my legs to continue moving forward. The artifact I had encountered earlier seemed to hum faintly in response to the energy in the water, but I ignored it, gloved fingers steady. Attempting contact, even mentally, would have been catastrophic. Survival required silence, and the trench demanded obedience above all else. Then, as I stepped over a ridge in the trench floor, I felt a presence brush against the back of my suit, slow, deliberate, and impossible to define. The vibrations through the water intensified, and shadows converged just at the edge of the red glow, forming an indistinct, horrifying mass. My breath caught, an instinct screamed to respond, to acknowledge, to communicate. But I forced myself forward, ignoring every impulse, trusting only the rule, trusting only the disciplined obedience that had carried me this far. One misstep could end it all. Ahead, a massive column of rock stretched impossibly high, shadows dancing across its surface like living patterns. The trench seemed to shift subtly, guiding me toward it, pressing me forward with gentle but undeniable force. Whispers and pulses brushed my helmet and gloves, teasing, testing, daring me to break the rule. My heartbeat roared in my ears as I took slow, deliberate steps, flashlight steady, hands gloved, eyes locked on the path. The trench itself waited, patient and intelligent, and I realized the next moment might decide whether I survived, or became just another shadow among the many that lurked beyond the red glow. The pressure around my suit tightened suddenly, and as the shadows swirled near the towering rock column, I remembered Rule 9. If the red glow fades, do not move until it returns. The rule echoed in my mind with a weight that tightened my chest, because the red glow around me was flickering more aggressively now, pulsing like a dying heartbeat. I stopped in place, legs stiff, hands frozen on the flashlight, knowing that even an inch of movement during darkness could expose me to the shifting shapes circling just outside the light. My breath fogged the inside of the helmet as the trench seemed to pull its glow inward, preparing to test me in a way it never had before. The glow dimmed slightly, then returned, then dimmed again, as if the abyss were inhaling and exhaling around me. Every instinct screamed to flee, to run, to force myself forward before the darkness swallowed me completely. But the rule was absolute, and I knew what ignoring it would mean. I stared straight ahead, locking my eyes on the part of the trench wall still touched by red, and forced my limbs to remain perfectly still. The shadows at the edge of the diminishing glow writhed in anticipation, stretching long fingers that curled and twisted toward me, retreating only when the glow brightened again. The flickering brightened momentarily, revealing more of the trench floor, and I used that brief second to assess the shapes circling me. They moved swiftly, faster than any creature should in deep water, their forms bending unnaturally as they slipped between cracks in the rock that seemed far too narrow to contain them. Their movements produced gentle shifts in the water, soft waves, subtle pushes, almost like breaths brushing against my suit. I could feel their attention, their patience, their expectation that I might break the rule. The glow flickered again, dimming lower than before, and my muscles tensed instinctively, threatening to betray me. The moment the glow waned, a deeper darkness began to coil around me, thicker and heavier, as though it carried its own weight. The shapes beyond the light pressed closer, testing the borders of the illumination with a hunger I could feel even through the reinforced suit. I forced myself to breathe silently, counting the seconds between each pulse of red, hoping the glow would return. The trench seemed to whisper in the vibrations pushing through my boots, subtle warnings or threats, and I clung to stillness like it was the only lifeline left. The darkness pulsed again, and the glow weakened until it felt like thin threads barely clinging to the edges of my vision. Another pulse rolled through the water, deep and resonant, causing the glow to flicker dangerously. My heart hammered, and I focused on the faint sliver of illuminated ground at my feet, refusing to let panic send me moving blindly. I could feel shapes circling me more tightly now, their movements more deliberate, more curious, almost brushing the suit. Something long moved behind me, and though I couldn't turn, I sensed its size, its slow and intentional drift around my back. The glow sputtered again, threatening to extinguish entirely, and I braced myself, refusing to break the rule, no matter how much instinct screamed at me to run. Seconds stretched into what felt like hours as I stood in place, frozen in a tomb of flickering red. The faint hum of the artifact inside my pack responded to the vibrations in the trench, creating a soft tremor that echoed down my spine. I imagined the shapes waiting for the last flicker of light to vanish, imagined them surrounding me, twisting around me, prepared to drag me into the unseen fractures of the trench floor. But I stayed still, breathing slowly, refusing to let fear dictate my movements. The glow brightened again, weak but present, and the shadows recoiled just slightly, their movements tense and deliberate. When the glow strengthened enough for visibility, I scanned ahead, searching for a path forward. The towering rock column had shifted somehow, or perhaps my perspective had changed during the moments of dimming light. The trench floor sloped downward into a narrow corridor that seemed even deeper, even darker, as though the fading glow had triggered some kind of reaction. I tested my grip on the flashlight, scanning the corridor, but hesitated to move fully until the glow brightened enough for safety. The shapes lingered at the borders, swirling slowly as if frustrated by my stillness. The glow dimmed again, this time without warning. My entire body stiffened instantly as darkness surged upward, swallowing nearly all detail and depth around me. I held my breath, every nerve screaming, waiting for the return of the red. The shapes pressed closer, and I sensed one drifting just in front of my helmet, a massive outline that blocked even the faintest hint of illumination. I did not move, not even an inch. The darkness embraced everything, wrapping around me like cold fingers, but I kept perfectly still, trusting the rule with my life. A faint pulse rippled through the water, and the red glow returned, weak but visible. The enormous shape in front of me retreated backward, dissolving into the shifting shadows beyond the light. I exhaled slowly, warmth fogging my helmet, and decided I couldn't remain trapped in this cycle forever. So when the glow steadied, I stepped carefully toward the narrow corridor. The floor sloped sharply, and the corridor walls pulsed softly in the red illumination, like the inside of some enormous dormant creature. I swallowed hard and moved, careful, slow, aware that the glow could dim again at any second. As I descended, the red glow grew brighter, almost guiding me deeper. The airless water felt warmer here, which made the hair on my neck stand up. Nothing at this depth should change temperature so rapidly. Shadows detached from the walls, slithering across the floor, but keeping their distance as long as I moved within the red. The corridor curved sharply, and as I approached the bend, I noticed a strange shimmer along the rock, something almost reflective. I leaned closer, keeping my steps deliberate, studying the shimmering surface. The reflection wasn't rock, it was an eye, massive, unblinking, the size of my helmet. And as the glow around me trembled with a faint pulse, the eye shifted slightly, focusing on me not with curiosity, but with the slow, deliberate gaze of something ancient, waiting for the next moment the light failed. The eye lingered in the red glow for a heartbeat too long, and I immediately remembered Rule 10. Never enter a trench passage you cannot fully see with your own light. My pulse raced as I realized the corridor ahead curved sharply into darkness, too deep and narrow for my flashlight to illuminate entirely. Every instinct screamed to stop, to retreat, to force the glow to reveal the unknown before proceeding. But the trench seemed to pulse impatiently, as if daring me to test my courage. Shadows at the edge of the red light shifted, stretching impossibly, and I felt the weight of the water pressing against every surface of my suit, reminding me that hesitation was dangerous, but forward movement could be fatal. I inched toward the bend, careful not to let the beam flicker or falter. The walls of the trench curved inward sharply, narrowing the visible floor to only a few meters, leaving the rest swallowed by shadow. I forced myself to focus, scanning every detail in the light I controlled, ignoring the faint glimmers just beyond its reach. My gloved hands trembled slightly on the flashlight, and every vibration from the trench floor pulsed through me like a warning. The deeper I moved into the corridor, the more it seemed alive. Each rock, each ripple, each shift in current deliberate and intentional, a trap waiting for the unwary. The red glow illuminated jagged outcroppings, twisted stone formations that seemed to bend unnaturally toward me. Shadows moved against the walls, moving in patterns that defied physics, curling, elongating, disappearing. I reminded myself that forward movement was only safe if every inch of the passage could be seen, and yet the trench seemed to test my discipline, pushing me closer to areas outside my own light. My heart pounded, and my breath came in sharp, calculated pulls, every muscle ready to react to the smallest disturbance. Even the current seemed alive, pressing against my suit in pulses that mirrored the glow's intensity. A sudden shift in water made my flashlight beam waver, revealing a crack in the trench wall that extended into shadowed depths I couldn't illuminate. The red glow flickered against the surfaces, creating an almost hypnotic rhythm that made the shadows dance in impossible ways. I froze, gripping the flashlight tightly, reminding myself silently of the rule. The trench tested my obedience, teasing me with glimpses of what I could not see fully, and every instinct urged me to enter, to uncover, to explore. But I forced myself to stay within the safe perimeter of my beam. The vibration from the trench floor increased slightly, and I realized that something enormous was moving just outside the reach of my light. The shadows twisted and flickered with purpose, circling the edges of the corridor, almost as if studying my every step. My pulse thumped against my chest plate as I took a measured step forward, keeping the flashlight aimed where I could see the entire floor. Every inch outside the beam was unknown, and the rule screamed in my mind that entering blind would be fatal. The trench was patient, intelligent, and waiting for the moment I broke my focus. I moved slowly, scanning ahead, and noticed subtle details in the red-lit walls, a jagged fracture, a faint reflection, a shimmer that suggested movement. My gloved hands tightened around the flashlight, knuckles white, as I realized the trench had created a series of visual traps, tricks of light and shadow designed to lure me into unseen dangers. Every instinct screamed to investigate, but I forced myself to obey, careful not to let curiosity overrule survival. I felt the water around my legs shift unexpectedly, a gentle brush against the suit, and I froze again, scanning every inch I could see. The corridor widened slightly, revealing an opening into a larger chamber, but even here, the red glow couldn't penetrate entirely. Shadows clung to the edges, twisting and writhing, and I sensed movement beyond the beam. A low vibration pulsed through the water, sending shivers up my spine. The trench seemed to measure my patience, testing whether I would obey the rule or risk everything for a glimpse of the unknown. I advanced slowly, only as far as my light fully revealed the floor, every step deliberate, every motion calculated. Then the glow flickered sharply, dimming for a second, and the shadows beyond my light surged closer. My pulse spiked as I realized the trench itself was manipulating the glow, forcing me to confront the boundary between safety and fatal curiosity. I gritted my teeth, focusing on the floor, the walls, the red-lit path, and refused to move further into darkness. My breath shuddered in the helmet, fogging slightly, and I whispered to myself that Rule 10 was the only thing keeping me alive. Every fiber of instinct screamed that the shadows outside the light were more than mere reflections. They were aware, deliberate, and patient. The corridor ahead curved again, and a faint shimmer caught my eye in the red light. My heart thumped violently as I recognized the same alien texture from the artifact I had found earlier, partially embedded in the trench floor just outside the light. The shadows near it stretched and swirled, as if aware of my hesitation, almost beckoning me to step beyond the boundary. I forced myself to resist, moving only where the light fully illuminated, refusing to enter the darkened edges, and focusing on every detail visible. The vibrations in the water intensified, a pulse that matched my heartbeat, pressing me to obey the rule. A sudden surge of current pushed me slightly forward, the flashlight wobbling and threatening to leave part of the floor unseen. I froze instantly, gripping the suit, and whispered again to myself, "Never enter a passage I cannot fully see." The shadows outside the red glow twitched, reacting to my stillness, as if testing my resolve. The trench seemed to hum in approval at my obedience, or perhaps in anticipation, letting me survive a moment longer, while the darkness waited patiently for a misstep. The next second felt like eternity, the corridor stretching ahead into shapes I could almost but not fully see. Then the red glow intensified abruptly, casting long flickering shadows across the chamber floor. Shapes shifted just beyond my flashlight, and I realized that the trench was alive, aware of every inch of movement. A faint pressure brushed against my suit, deliberate and probing, testing whether I would step forward blindly. I pressed forward only as far as my light allowed, gloved hands trembling slightly on the flashlight, heart pounding, breath shallow. The trench seemed to close in, folding the chamber around me, and I knew the next moment could reveal what waited in total darkness, or leave me lost to it forever. The passage finally opened into a massive shadowed cavern, walls stretching beyond the reach of my flashlight, and I immediately remembered Rule 11. When you reach the end of the trench, never turn around. My heartbeat roared as I advanced, the red glow from above painting jagged silhouettes across the floor. Every shadow seemed alive, coiling and stretching in ways that defied logic, moving as though aware of my presence. Currents pushed against my suit deliberately, yet I pressed forward, knowing the moment I dared to look back would seal my fate. The trench had been patient, testing me at every step, and this final rule was its ultimate warning. The cavern floor dropped slightly, revealing jagged rocks and deep fissures I could barely illuminate with my flashlight. I moved cautiously, gloved hands steady, focusing only on the path ahead, refusing to glance over my shoulder. A subtle vibration ran through the water, rhythmic and deliberate, almost like a heartbeat, but far larger, far more ancient than anything natural. Shapes twisted and swirled beyond the light, teasing me with impossible movements. But I obeyed. Forward was all I could allow myself, the only choice that preserved my life, though every fiber of instinct screamed at me to flee from the unknown. The red glow from above pulsed faintly, bathing the cavern in eerie shifting light. Shadows stretched impossibly long, curling along the jagged walls, forming shapes that suggested limbs, faces, and eyes. Yet nothing concrete. My breath came in shallow bursts, echoing faintly inside the helmet, as I reminded myself to ignore the whispers, the pulses, the subtle currents trying to make me hesitate. The trench itself seemed to press in from every direction, observing, calculating, testing the final measure of obedience. I kept moving, step by careful step, focusing on the illuminated floor, gloved hands gripping the flashlight, eyes locked ahead. Ahead, a formation of jagged rock loomed like a doorway, a natural archway leading deeper into the cavern, and I could feel the currents shifting strangely around it. The red glow brightened just enough to reveal a vast depression beyond, stretching into darkness. Shapes moved just at the edge of visibility, flickering and coiling as if daring me to turn and look back. My pulse raced, adrenaline surging through every vein, but I forced myself forward, eyes on the floor, reminding myself silently that the rule demanded I never turn around. Any deviation, any hesitation, and the trench would claim me. The shadows outside the beam began to twist more aggressively, forming shapes that seemed almost humanoid, yet impossibly long, jointless, and fluid. Every vibration through the water pressed against my suit like deliberate testing, probing the limits of my courage. My flashlight beam swung carefully, revealing a path that curved into a narrower channel beyond the archway. Each step into this narrowing felt heavier, as if the water itself resisted my movement. I swallowed hard, forcing my legs to continue, my gloved hands gripping the flashlight like a lifeline, knowing that the trench's patience was reaching its peak. A sudden shift in the current made the floor tremble, and I stumbled slightly, catching myself against the jagged rock. Shadows surged at the edges of the light, twisting, almost laughing, almost alive in a way that made my stomach turn. I pressed forward, careful not to glance behind me, forcing my breathing steady. Every instinct screamed that the end of the trench was no longer a place of safety, but a trap, a final test. Yet the rule was absolute, and I reminded myself that turning around, even for a second, would mean instant annihilation. The narrow corridor beyond the archway opened into a chamber larger than anything I had seen, filled with red-lit columns of rock that seemed impossibly tall, stretching beyond my vision. Shadows danced across the surfaces in impossible patterns, coiling, stretching, moving with intent. The vibration in the water intensified, a steady, deep pulse as though some colossal entity beneath the trench floor had finally taken notice of me. My heartbeat thundered in my chest, echoing inside the helmet, yet I pressed forward. Every step was deliberate, gloved hands firm on the flashlight, eyes locked ahead, refusing to betray the rule. I reached the edge of a vast fissure in the cavern floor, illuminated faintly by the red glow above. The trench opened into a void of darkness beyond the jagged lip, and I realized this was the true end, the point where the rule mattered most. Shadows gathered at the edges, forming long, jointless shapes that writhed with purpose, almost as if aware of my hesitation. Currents brushed against my legs and suit with deliberate intent, urging me to glance, to hesitate, to look back. But I kept moving forward, one careful step at a time, repeating the rule in my head, feeling the trench press in from every side. Then I felt it, a subtle brush along the back of my suit, deliberate, measured, almost like fingers caressing the edges of my helmet. My pulse surged violently, and for a fraction of a second, the instinct to glance backward clawed at me. My breath hitched as the red glow pulsed, flickering, casting dancing shadows across the cavern floor. Every fiber of my being screamed to look, to see what waited behind me, but I forced myself forward. The rule was absolute: never turn around. Survival depended entirely on obeying that single final command. The fissure stretched infinitely, a yawning void below, and I felt the water vibrate with a resonance that matched my heartbeat. Shadows writhed just at the limits of the red light, swirling with patient intelligence, almost as if aware of my obedience. I moved forward, trembling, knowing that the trench had tested me in every way possible, every rule designed to measure my will, and that the final moment had arrived. My flashlight beam swung across the floor, highlighting jagged columns and swirling shadows, and the vibration intensified, pressing in, surrounding me. And then the red glow pulsed violently one last time, brighter than I had ever seen, and I felt the trench close around me in a way that was both literal and impossible. Shadows twisted toward the beam in impossible shapes, reaching, testing, stretching. I took the final step forward into the unknown, feeling the water shift, the pressure tighten, the pulse of the abyss synchronized with my own heartbeat. I did not turn. I could not turn. The darkness consumed everything behind me, swallowing the shadows, the light, and the trench walls in a silence so absolute it vibrated in my skull. And in that silence, I understood, with terrifying clarity, that obeying the final rule was not salvation. It was only the beginning of something far older, far larger, and far more patient than I could ever imagine. If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more.